I've been hand planing my workbench top to get it to a final smoothness, and it's just not really working the greatest. It was doing most of the job, but I'm having a lot of trouble with tear out, and when all of a sudden it takes a big gouge out of the wood, I just can't keep going any further. I've tried adding a back bevel to the blade, and it was still tearing out. I don't think it was as bad, but it still was doing it, and I just can't keep going with that method. It's just digging up my workbench top too much. So I decided to try the router sled idea and see what I can do with that. Basically, you just put two boards on the sides of the workbench and clamp those on like a 1/4 of an inch above. Run a crisscross of wires, and you can fine tune those to make sure that the boards are parallel to each other, and that you're going to have a flat top when you end up cutting that with the router bit. Then you set a router sled on top of the 2x6s that are going to be on each side. This is where the bit will go in here, and the router will sit in here and slide back and forth. These edges just keep the bottom flat, and on the bottom I added pieces so that they couldn't come off of the 2x6 and all of a sudden drop down a 1/4 of an inch and then the router bit dig in, because the last thing I need is any more digging in on my workbench top. So I'll be giving this a try, and I'm kind of anxious so that something might go wrong, but I'm kind of excited because I think this might do it. Let's see how it goes. I started by clamping two boards to the legs underneath the bench. I had some blocks underneath them too, so that it would, if I set the 2x4s and 2x6s on top of those on the sides of the bench, that the 2x6 would be about a 1/4 of an inch higher than the top of the table. The 2x4 is going to be about the same level as the top, and the router sled will actually run on the 2x6, the outer board. That way I can run the bit off into the 2x4 and make sure I get all of the top flattened. These boards just hold the 2x4s and 2x6s until I can clamp those to the side, so it just makes it easier for me to set them there when I'm working all by myself. This is what it looks like from the top. The 2x4s still need to be lifted up so that they're even with the top of the workbench, and you can see on the one side there's the little pieces sticking out from the under the support below where that's clamped to the legs. Here it is. That's the 2x6 on the far left on the outside. The 2x4 is on the inside, which will be about the same height as the workbench top. And I'm measuring to make sure it's about a 1/4 of an inch above the level of the top throughout the top. So I take measurements at different places. Here's my wires attached just with some sheetrock screws. They're very tight. You want to make sure they're super tight so they're as straight as possible. And the top wire is supported by little pieces on each side because you want it to be absolutely straight. If you didn't do that, they would be bending where they meet. So by putting a little piece on both sides of the top wire, it elevates it up. Here's a close-up. This elevates that wire, the width of the wire, which will kind of be like the other wire, the bottom wire, so that both wires are absolutely straight when they touch in the middle. To get these wires set up, you want to make sure that they are just barely touching, so that if you push the bottom wire down, the top wire shouldn't move. But if you touch the top wire, the bottom wire should move immediately. There shouldn't be any delay. It should just be barely touching. And that will get your workbench top flat. The ends of this top wire are raised up by one piece of wire so that the wire is exactly straight. Otherwise, if you didn't do that, the bottom wire would be bent a little bit and the top wire would be bent a little bit. It just wouldn't ever really work. So by sticking a little piece on the underneath this wire and a little piece on this side underneath that wire on your outer board. That keeps this wire parallel and this wire parallel underneath, or straight. So it looks like that's all set up. So now I can take the wires off. I've got 3 clamps clamping the 2x6s to the top of the bench to make sure that those 2x6s do not move at all while I'm doing the routing, because that would also be a bad thing to happen. So I have an 1.5" bit. I'll have links below where you can get that bit and you can see what it is. So I'm just moving the router sled 1.5" over, well actually probably like 1.25" because it's got to overlap a little bit. And I'm just kind of doing that all by eye, so. Got to make sure too that you don't get sawdust underneath the router sled in the 2x6. Because that will change the elevation of that router sled and then it won't be flat anymore. So the 2x6s are jointed on top, so they're very flat and smooth and straight. I also planed the edges of the 2x4s so that they would be flat against my workbench top, because I didn't want to leave impressions of the rough 2x4 into my workbench top. So basically you just make a pass back and forth, go into the 2x4 a little bit on the edge so that you make sure you get off of the workbench top so that you get all the wood off. The 2x4 also keeps the edge of your workbench top from tearing out when you get to the end. So at this point I was happy because it was looking really good and it was looking really flat and smooth. You want to take off as little as possible, so I measured all around and found the lowest spot and set the bit there. You can also make sure that measuring all around, if one side or the other is taking off too much material, you can raise that one side and then do the wire thing, you know, keep with the wire still on there, I guess, because you'll need to do that again if you move it. So the sled's made out of 3/4 inch plywood. I did sand inside there so that the router base would smoothly go over it as smoothly as possible. So you can see in the top there's some little variations, some very tiny variations from the bit from each pass. I was still pretty happy. That sanded right out, so no big deal at all. Took off all the rest of the clamps from underneath and the boards, and ta-da! So I was doing a little test sanding here to see how those marks would come out. Turned out better than I thought. Just some light sanding, I think, and that's going to have a perfectly great workbench top now. So that's exciting. I'm going to continue on with my little drawer cabinet that will sit on top of the stretchers, but I'm trying to keep it as low as possible under the workbench. Hit like and subscribe. Thanks.